This is Talking Drupal, a weekly chat about web design and development from a group of people with one thing in common. We love Drupal and WordPress. This is episode 386, Drupal vs. WordPress. Welcome to Talking Drupal. Today we're talking about Drupal and WordPress with Maciej Palmowski. Maciej is a web developer working at Kinsta as a development advocate analyst. After hours, he spends most of his time trying to find interesting guests for the Code and Coffee Show or cycling. Maciej, welcome to the show and thank you for joining us.
Hi, everyone.
I'm Nick Laughlin, founder at Enlightened Development, and today my co-hosts are, as usual, John Picozzi, solution architect at EPAM.
Hello.
And also joining us for the third week, Catherine Druckman, open source evangelist at Intel. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me again.
And now, to talk about our module of the week, let's bring in Martin Anderson-Klutz, a senior solutions engineer at Acquia and maintainer of a number of modules of his own. Martin, what do you have for us this week?
Thanks, Nick. I thought this week we would talk about the WordPress Migrate module, which supports migrating WordPress exports into Drupal, including posts, pages, attachments, tags, and categories. The module was originally created in December of 2010, but it has a more recent 8.x-3.0 Alpha 5 version that was created in October of 2021. It seems to have a release about every year and a half, so probably due for a new release to establish Drupal 10 compatibility. And it currently has 76 open issues, 43 of which are for the 8.x branch, and of those, 14 are bugs, which is not bad considering the site is officially listed as being in use by over 2,000 websites, though that number could easily be underestimated because I imagine it's the kind of a module that a site would use once, sort of at launch, and then potentially disable. The most recent releases appear to be by Hong Pong, who actually looks like joined Drupal.org within a couple of months of me over 16 years ago. And talking a little bit more about the module, it really leverages the migrate module that's in Drupal core to ingest the WXR files that WordPress can generate. It also relies on migrate tools and the CTools modules, again, kind of under the hood. Also worth noting that WordPress looks like has a tool for exporting users separately, and so that file would need to be ingested separately by something like the user CSV import module. So let's talk about either the WordPress migrate module or more generally experiences anybody's had kind of migrating content from a WordPress site into Drupal.
Can I ask a clarifying question? Because I just had to look this up. WXR files are specific to WordPress, it seems. Is that correct?
That's my understanding, yes.
Yeah, okay. Because I just looked it up and it stands for WordPress expanded RSS, I think, or something to that effect.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those are similar to RSS, and to be honest, the biggest problem right now is with the newest editor. So the moment when WordPress started playing around with Gutenberg, which is really nice for the users, it's horrible for the developers because when the decision was made about creating the new editor, this Gutenberg, they wanted to make it as backward compatible as like everything in WordPress. So the data is saved as HTML in the content. So if you would like to parse it, well, have fun.
I imagine the WordPress migrate module will have probably some sort of update to handle that, bringing that into Drupal, because I mean that's probably essentially a straight migration of like HTML from one place, dropping it into HTML in another place. Right?
Yes, but the question is, do you want to migrate the whole HTML, or would you prefer this to like divide it into data? Because when you create those blocks, you there are two approaches. One is for the dynamic blocks, when you like literally save that some variable equals this, some equals this, and then you connect it with the template, which is quite easier later on to separate the data from the rest, because it is already separated. And the second way is you have the HTML and you like inform the block that in the H1 there is the title, in the div with some class there is the description,
Right.
some, and so on and so on. So if you would like to move this data to another CMS, yeah, it's not so fun. I played around with this more with StateMake. It wasn't fun at all.
Yeah, Gutenberg is structured data essentially, but it's storing the data as just rendered output in the database. So when you're trying to migrate that, you're either parsing HTML directly or you're losing that structured element of the data when you're moving it in.
Has anybody, going back to the module, I'm just curious, has anybody used this module? Because I think I looked at it once, like maybe 10 years ago for something.
I think I'm in this. I think I'm in the same camp. I think I used it one time, a very, very, very long time ago. The thing is, usually when I'm migrating, I like to write my own migrations. So I've not used this tool, but I'm curious about how clean it is. It's been a long time since I've looked at it.
Yeah, it definitely sounds as though, depending on what editor was being used on the WordPress site, it may work very smoothly, or as we talked about, potentially
or not
provide some challenges in terms of just ingesting a giant blob of HTML that's meant to be structured.
Sorry, in my head, I just likened it to like a Drupal 7 to Drupal 9 migration, which is like really not a migration; it's a rebuild, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think the other thing too is it really depends on what plugins you're using WordPress, right? If you're using advanced custom fields versus just native WordPress, those migrations probably change a decent amount too. But it's always nice to have tools that get you, at least give you a good starting point.
I think Drupal in general has a lot of robust migration tools. Whether, I think this is an interesting larger conversation, although, right now we're talking about WordPress, but just in general, talking about Drupal migration tools is worthy in itself. I can't think if I've ever actually migrated from WordPress to Drupal, but I've done some weird Drupal migrations. And each time it was both difficult and surprisingly smooth, if that makes any sense. And I might guess it's the same in this case, even with Gutenberg, or, I don't know. I do understand the difference coming from the Drupal world, going and using something like Gutenberg, which I have done. You have to think about the structure and the content a little bit differently, because to my mind, it's like, oh, well, I would have done, you would have done this with fields or with, certain other Drupal-y things. And so to translate the two is a bit weird, I think. I struggle with the concept of Gutenberg as well.
And we have talked with Mauricio a couple of times, who's kind of a Drupal migration expert, on episode 352 and episode 295, if you're curious about that, hearing more about migration. Well, thank you, Martin. As always, a great topical module of the week. So looking forward to see what you have next week for us. We like to start our shows off with, simpler questions, although this might be on the more complex side of that. What is WordPress?
Yeah, I mean, the simplest answer is it's a CMS, and it, based on some numbers, I think it's the most popular CMS out there. So this is the most basic answer that I can give. But when we dive in a bit more, so for sure, this is a very popular CMS written in PHP. So, and if I remember, it's only a bit younger than Drupal. There isn't a big difference when it comes to age.
I think a couple of years. It's pretty close.
But I remember that this was the moment when we had WordPress, Drupal, and Joomla all together, and right now, when it comes to the popularity, WordPress has those 40% of the market. Although it's kind of questionable how it is counted. So, but let's leave it as it is. So let's say 40% of the market, and it's also a huge market. I mean, there are a lot of plugins, a lot of themes, an enormous community. So
I think it's important to call out too that it is open source, as just like
of
Drupal.
course, yes.
It does have one thing that's very different from Drupal is a lot of the plugin ecosystem is not open source though. In Drupal in general, every plugin is open source.
I think
WordPress
that-
has a lot of premium plugins that are paid.
But they still have to be open source, if I remember, because if you want to use WordPress, in theory, everything should be.
Yeah, isn't it? Aren't the plugins open source to a point, and then you pay for premium features? Isn't that typically how it works?
Very often, it's more about this when plugin itself is open source, but some things are stored on the server.
Yeah,
and so
Yeah,
this is one thing. Yeah.
And that does not exist in the Drupal world. I mean, there's only one or two modules like that in Drupal, and those are more like a backup service where the paid part is you're transporting the backup to their servers for them to maintain. So it truly is a service, like a cloud service that you're paying for. Whereas a lot of them, you need a license key to unlock certain features in WordPress, like ACF.
Sorry, I actually have a question about going back to the WordPress and being like, I think you said 40% of the market, right? Is now Automatic is kind of like the company behind WordPress, similar to how Acquia is the company behind Drupal, right? I'm wondering, is there a like a hosted version of WordPress? Like, can you go and get like a hosted version of WordPress somewhere that you can just like kind of spin up and just use the CMS on Automatic's servers?
Yes. I mean,
Okay.
there are you can even do it in like I mean, the most popular. We have WordPress.org, which is the site when you go where you want to download your code, and there's WordPress.com.
Got it. Yep. Okay.
And this is the hosted version on Automatic servers, and but as you can. But this is also kind of a problem with using this WordPress.org versus WordPress.com. Many users who start their adventure, or they just heard something about WordPress, that it exists and that it's popular and that it's easy and something, and they don't know what is the difference between them. This move was made on purpose by Automatic to
right.
To create the situation. So I don't like it, to be honest.
Yeah, the reason I ask is just because I don't know that there's a Drupal equivalent to that. Like, I don't know that there's a way that you can just like kind of go to a site and spin up a Drupal site. So that I was curious. Just out of curiosity, do you have any Drupal experience?
I mean, long time ago, I played around a bit with Drupal, and the fun part was that back then I remember that the thing that I really didn't like about Drupal is, and like, let me remind, it was very long time ago. I thought that it's complicated with this templating system and everything, and the fun part is that for over the years I did everything in WordPress to start having a similar experience. So I was always using those this module called Bedrock. It's like having WordPress in a more, let's call it, enterprisey way. So it was always using Composer. Then I was using Twig, which is nothing else. Timber, which is nothing else than Twig for WordPress, and so on. So it took me a while to start having the similar experience that Drupal always aimed for, and especially I mean, maybe almost, because at some point Drupal decided to go all in and got rewritten to Symfony, right? Symfony,
Right.
yeah. And WordPress never did this, and I think that this will be a problem at some point. I mean, it already is with the upcoming PHP versions.
I just want to actually go around. So you have our WordPress. You know, you're filling in our WordPress bucket here. I just want to go around to the rest of the hosts here and just try to figure out where people lie in their WordPress versus Drupal knowledge. Before the show, Nick had asked me if I ever built a WordPress site, and I admittedly said no. So clearly, I have like very little knowledge of, like, obviously I know what WordPress is and kind of how it works, but that's pretty much it for me. Catherine, what about you?
Yeah, so I've built a few WordPress sites. My personal feeling is that WordPress is very good at a specific thing, and that is a blog type site. Now, lots of other people will say, "Oh no, it's a robust full CMS just like Drupal," but my personal experience is that I tend to prefer it for things that are where you want a simple, quick, pretty straightforward site of a type. Whereas for anything with any kind of complexity, any kind of complex content architecture or functionality or users, yep, I would always go for Drupal. But that's my comfort level, and
Yeah. And so you have experience in both, and I think, admittedly, we've said this on a show before. Your personal site is
my
built
personal
in
site.
WordPress.
Yes,
right?
back to that easy comment.
Yeah. No, that's understandable. Simple. That's understandable. And then Nick, you, I think, told us beforehand you started working on a WordPress site for the first time, like this year.
Yeah, well, last year. So I built a very complex WordPress site for the first time, start to end. Well, technically, it was, I think we're at 8 sites right now. So I built one main site, and then they very quickly spun off additional ones. So I built a very complex theme, sub-theme system, and a very complex plugin to manage Gutenberg blocks using native web components. So I feel like I have a decent amount of experience with WordPress, but obviously it's not years and years and multiple projects. There's one thing to having a lot of experience in something like Drupal, where I've been using Drupal for 15 years now across multiple versions for many different project types and many different paradigms. So, I can say, I would say I'm a Drupal expert. With WordPress, I would say I'm maybe a little bit more than a novice because I came at it with a lot of PHP experience, but I definitely wouldn't call myself a WordPress expert. But I've built non-trivial site in WordPress. Let's leave it at that.
I've never built a non-trivial WordPress site. I'm definitely a WordPress novice. I'm an end user, basically. So that's where a lot of my feeling comes from. I haven't found a reason to do that, because again, for me, the answer would always be Drupal. So.
I mean, in my case, it's kind of funny because I built a lot of WordPress sites, but when it comes to using them, I think I only have 2 small websites that are a base for newsletters, and that's it. So it was also a very interesting experience when I handed over the website, and at some point someone asked me, could you introduce it to someone, to the new user? And I was like, yeah, but you already have someone who is using it, so that person will know much more than me because I don't use it. I just write the code, and that's it.
So what are some pros of Drupal over WordPress?
Okay. I would say the biggest one is so simple.
I'm curious. I was gonna say I'm curious what your
Symfony, the Symfony underneath. Really, this is something so huge because it makes the development so much simpler.
Yeah.
The Drupal community don't have to worry about some things as long as the Symfony community will be working on Symfony, right? Because of course, the moment when this would become a problem, then Drupal also has a big problem.
Yeah.
But the Symfony community is so big, so this should not ever be a problem. And I think that many CMSs went down that road, because we have Drupal that is built on Symfony. We have StateMake that is built on Laravel. We have Craft, which is built on Yi, or whatever you pronounce it. I never wondered. I'm always surprised when I see this name Yi. But still, so everyone stands on a big framework, and the moment when the new PHP version comes out or something like this, I mean, of course, the CMS community also has to add some changes to make everything working, but the biggest part lays on the framework itself. And with WordPress, it's different.
Yeah, and it's supported by multiple teams. Developer experience was definitely one of the things top of mind for me comparing Drupal to WordPress. I would say there are a couple other things that really stood out to me working on WordPress. One of them was build tools. So you mentioned Bedrock and you mentioned Timber as ways to use Twig in WordPress and Composer, but those are supported by essentially one person, right? Whereas Drupal has built in, like, if you're building a Drupal site, it's expected that you're using Composer. Now, there are exceptions, but it's supported in core, right? If I want to, and because it's supported in core, if I have a private module or a custom module for a client that really doesn't make sense to be public, because it's really just like integrating functionality that only makes sense for one client, right? But they have multiple sites and they want to release that to multiple things. Like, you can set up a private packagist and it just works. WordPress is like update plugin process out of the box. Like, you have to have like a server that it really doesn't manage updates. It kind of just notifies them, hey, there's something to update here. The update hook setup isn't as clean. So I would say build tools in the Drupal world are significantly better managed. There's also a lot more of the hosts in the Drupal world support that, right? Pantheon, Platform, Aqua, they all integrate with Composer. So your code base only has to have the Composer piece, and you can do all the building on your environment. WP Engine, WordPress.com, I don't think that they have integration with Composer. If you want to use Composer in your build process, you have to use something like Travis CI or Circle CI. And so
That's
a lot
true.
of that ecosystem is better. The other real standout thing for me is structured data. You can do structured data in WordPress, and you can do it a lot more now with Gutenberg. But my experience has been that it's a lot more developer heavy. So if I want to define structured data in Gutenberg, I have to do that in PHP. Like, I have to define, like, this Gutenberg block has these fields, these field types. And usually you're using a plugin like ACF to define those. Whereas in Drupal, I mean, you might need to use a plugin, but in Drupal, when you're defining an entity, you're doing that in the interface. You're adding a telephone field to a contact form or something in the UI, and then exporting that config. Whereas in WordPress, you're writing PHP code to do that same task.
Or React code, because with Gutenberg you should, in theory, go with React out of the box. But yeah, you are totally right. I mean, this is kind of funny, because with WordPress there is this huge flexibility. Everyone can do everything in their own way, which sometimes is cool because, like I said, you have flexibility. But on the other hand, it can be the biggest nightmare, because you try to, I don't know, take over some service, and you are starting to look at the code and you wonder, what is this? What is this? Why someone wrote it this way? And or even the simple thing, when we quite quickly realize, but why there isn't a composer to manage all the plugins or libraries or something like this? Because
So I think
Yeah.
I mean, I think
Yeah.
that to me sounds true of either platform, right? So like that you can have that instance, you can have something like that happen in Drupal. It sounds like you can have something like that happen in WordPress, right? Based on what you and Nick were talking about, one thing that I'm still wondering, right, is like based on what you guys were just talking about, you pretty much like drove home the stereotype that like Drupal is more for developers and WordPress is more for designers, right? So I'm wondering like if what you guys have experienced, and obviously you guys have experienced this more from the development side, but like, are there any pros in the like user experience design space that Drupal has over WordPress, or is WordPress still kind of the air quotes industry leader in like ease of use and like ease of content creation?
I would say that again, when it comes to WordPress, it's a bit more complicated because right now we are in this era. First of all, we have Gutenberg. Gutenberg is growing. We are launching this full site editing experience.
Mhm.
So anyone without a line of code should be able to create a website just by clicking here and there. You can just import some custom blocks and everything, but in general, you should not even have to write a line of code. Cool. But on the other hand, we also have page builders. They were even before Gutenberg was created. So we have those Elementor, Divi, and all the rest. And they differ a bit. They have, for the end users, it's kind of similar because you have those blocks and you just move them around. And it's easy for them. From developer side, it's of course a totally different experience every time. So sometimes migrating the content between website built in Elementor or in Gutenberg can be a quite fun experience. And so I would say that, but still, for sure, WordPress gives a lot of options if someone would like to go with this no code or let's say low code approach.
Yeah.
Right.
It comes with some cons like speed and things like that, but you can.
A good analogy in the Drupal world is kind of field collections versus paragraphs. You know, they're two ways to organize your data, structure data. But the difference is in the WordPress community, you would imagine field collections and paragraphs would have a whole company behind them. It would be a paid solution, and they would both be completely supported. So for you, Maciej, field collections was a way to have different fields tied together. So for example, if you wanted to create a list of items where you needed to have a name and then an email, right? Field collections would say like every time you add one of these, you have to add a name and an email together, and you can add as many as you want. A little bit of detail, field collections came out before, I think the field API was completed in Drupal 7 or the form API, maybe, probably the field API. And so it just interacted differently internally. And then once that was completed, paragraphs basically does the same thing, but it uses the API. So it's a little bit more structured. Now, the community kind of as a whole has stopped using field collections, right? Entirely. And uses paragraphs almost exclusively. But it's a similar thing. The difference is in WordPress, there's a whole company behind it. So it gets updated and managed and maintained. So it still has a user base. So you would kind of imagine if both of those were in use in Drupal at the same time, you know, some projects would use one, some projects would use another. And then if you have a project that's trying to use both, things would get really messy really quickly. And that's kind of the same thing there. Well, I think we would be remiss if we didn't mention that WordPress does do some other things better than Drupal too, right? We can't, as much as people
Impossible.
on this podcast, as much as we love Drupal, there are some things that WordPress does. And I have a couple of things in mind, but I'm curious, what are the things that you see that WordPress does better than Drupal?
I think that the biggest pro when it comes to WordPress versus Drupal is the fact that WordPress is more familiar to everyone. and this makes the general user experience, end user, not developer, end user experience much better, because there is a bigger chance that the person who will like to start a website will already know WordPress. And when it comes to Drupal, it's a bit more difficult. Drupal is just less popular. And every time when we talk about CMSs, we have to remember that it's not just a cool playground for us developers, so we can add some new functions, some new toys and things like this. It's also a workspace for the content team, for the marketing, and they have to feel good with it. And if they are familiar with the solution, yeah, that's one of the biggest pros there can be.
Yeah, I definitely see like a lower barrier to entry to WordPress, right? We talked at the top of the show with the automatic solution of like, hey, I need a site. Here's WordPress, like, and basically having a platform that you can build your website on, and then editing tools that come out of the box when installing WordPress. So like from a ease of use, like site editor experience, I can see where where Drupal requires more configuration and kind of more of that like developer intervention before you can kind of get up and running with it.
There's also a couple of things that it does really well. I think one of the advantages of WordPress over Drupal is the custom theme ecosystem. WordPress has custom themes for days, right? Especially if you're a small freelancer, that's great, because if you're doing sites for plumbers or electricians or something like that, then you can take themes out of the box that will, look completely different and work great for them. So you don't have to have a huge amount of effort to kind of theme and design a site for them. You can kind of put those sites out easily. And Drupal just doesn't exist. I mean, there are a couple of contributed themes, but nothing like WordPress.
I can even tell you how many there are themes in the official repository, because I was writing something a few days ago. So if I remember, there are 10,000 themes in the official WordPress repository. So those are those free ones. And there is also a huge market if we would go to Avato, or there are so many developers, companies who just develop few themes that have like thousands of variations. And when we add the possibility of Gutenberg, when you can just add a block. So
it's one of the best things about the WordPress development experience, I think. Like that just has never really existed for Drupal.
So Nick, I want to dive into that a little bit more, because obviously I'm a Drupal fanboy, but I tend to agree with you that like off the shelf themes for Drupal are kind of like annoying and don't always work as advertised, right? So I'm wondering what makes the WordPress theme ecosystem, other than the fact that there are a million of them, right, easier for you to implement?
First of all, we have to divide them into those free themes and the paid ones. So let's start with the free themes. You just install them and they work. I mean, most of them, because some also can be problematic. We also have, like, every year we have this 20 and the year number theme that shows what can you do right now in WordPress. It's a bit of a show-off theme, but it also gives a great perspective of what changed. And if we would start looking at how this main WordPress theme changed over the years, it's huge. It's just huge. Personally, I never was a fan of using them, but I know how many people just with a bit of CSS could do magic based on those. And on the other hand, we have the pay themes, and with them, it's simple. It's all about money. So the company behind them will be doing everything to make it easier to use, more user-friendly, create some add-ons for it. Very often they are like all-in-one themes. So you have like humongous amount of options, and you just go into the menu and you just click here, click there, and ta-da! You have a working website for, I don't know,
Yep.
electrician, plumber, whatever. But it was simple. It was a very simple experience, and while for me, for a long time, I felt that this is kind of cheating because we are developers, we have agencies or whatever, so we should code our themes. But then I
Yep.
learned how many other agencies who are just using those pre-made parts,
Yeah.
merge them together, style them, and they earn a lot of money. I mean, probably more than I ever did. But
Yeah.
I mean, I could felt like a typical Polish football team. I was a moral winner, even if I lost. This is kind of
Yeah. No, I think one of the interesting things too is that, or what, it's a double-edged sword. I mean, it's a great positive for the WordPress community, especially for, I think, smaller freelancers and for agencies, like you said, that are just kind of like generally just putting out small like marketing sites or something and just need something quick and that maybe looks a little different. The downside, I think, is, and I think this is one of the huge cons of WordPress in general, is there is so much functionality in WordPress that just gets done in the theme, right? And
it's changing. I mean, in theory, we
it's
should
changing,
not.
but
I mean,
it still happens.
let's remember. Officially, we should never do this. Never, ever. It's prohibited. Yeah, of course, everyone is doing it.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
officially, we should.
Well, and that's one of the things that causes problems sometimes when you're switching themes. But it's like I said, it's a huge advantage. I think the other advantage,
but that's not. I mean, that's just not just WordPress specific. Like,
yeah,
there are instances where people would do that in Drupal. Like I've taken over Drupal sites where people have put functionality into their themes, and you switch themes, and like whole portions of websites are just gone, right? And you're just
absolutely.
like, why would you do this, right?
Yeah.
So it's not. I mean, I don't think that's just specifically WordPress.
Yep. And I think the other place that WordPress kind of shines over Drupal is SEO, and not that WordPress is better than Drupal for SEO. I think it's just that there's kind of two prongs to this. One is WordPress seems to have far more SEO plugin options, although I think some of that's due to how strong Drupal's kind of meta tag suite is. Like Drupal doesn't really need all that many options because meta tag knocks it out of the park. But I think the other piece is WordPress is so ubiquitous that if you're working with an SEO firm, they kind of by default assume you have a WordPress site. So their advice is going to be tailored to WordPress. And it can take, I mean, if you're working with a better SEO firm, they'll make their stuff more generic. They'll understand that you're using a different technology. But the truth is, they assume you're using WordPress. They're going to give you WordPress specific advice. And so, I think that's, that's kind of a pro just because WordPress has so much more of an install base than Drupal. But it is something that I've seen. I so many times when we start working with the new SEO firm, we have to be like, we're not using WordPress. We're using Drupal. We need you to modify your advice to us to match the technology we're using.
That feels like, I don't know. That feels weird to me. Like, I feel like an SEO firm should be providing SEO feedback, not like specific WordPress SEO feedback, right? Like,
that is not a statement I disagree with.
Right?
Yes, because SEO should be totally like, I don't know, language or framework or the CMS agnostic, because it doesn't matter. The rules should be the same. But I can tell you that it's not only about WordPress, because I mean, the golden standard when it comes to SEO plugins in WordPress, it's using the Yoast SEO plugin, just like this. I mean, the company behind it is doing an amazing job. They really know how to do it. They constantly optimize the plugin to make sure that everything that the plugin prints out works like really well with what's happening in Google. They also have a lot of add-ons for it, for like I don't know, local marketing and whatever. And but they are not the only plugin there is. But still, if someone asks you about, so you probably have a Yoast SEO plugin installed, and someone will tell, no, I'm using something else. And most of those SEO companies will be, oh, so we don't know what to do right now.
So interestingly, I've heard of Yoast, right? And it's how great it is at SEO. I'm wondering, Nick, is meta tag not equivalent? I know that Yoast does some sort of suggestion. It has some sort of suggestion engine in it, how you can improve your SEO. Is that accurate?
Yes, it is.
I know that. Yeah, I was gonna say it'd be better to ask Maciej that, because the project I used did use Yoast, but I kind of just installed it and let them configure it.
Sorry, that was poor question asking on my part, because I had asked Nick about the comparison to like the meta tag module in Drupal, and then I also asked about the suggestion matrix. So let's answer the comparability to Drupal first, and then we can talk about how it suggests things.
Yeah, I think one of the big differences is that like meta tag is self-configured, right? You can set defaults, you can set options, but generally you're in charge of setting, what are the tags and which ones are you installing. And I think it's a little bit more automated on the Yoast side.
Yeah, because Yoast on like the default Yoast configuration gives you meta tags, some basic JSON LD. There are also quite a few options when it comes to simplifying the configuration of connection to connect to like WordPress, the Google Webmaster Tools, and things like this. So there is a lot like out of the box, and we are still talking about the free version, and the premium has some more options. But the cool part of being a developer was I never used the pro version. I just wrote my own add-ons, because it's also amazingly extendable, and really. So I would say that this was always, especially for me, one of the coolest feature about Yoast. But still, I would say that we missed one thing, because we only talk about SEO plugins, and I would say that in general the plugins market is something huge, because again, I know the number because I also checked this: 60,000 free plugins just to install, and also a huge more premium ones.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
And they also tend to be, sorry, go ahead. I was going to say they tend to be more complete solutions too. WordPress plugins, you'll get it. It solves your problem in A to Z. Whereas Drupal,
you install
a ton of modules, but it's all like Legos, and you have to put it together yourself. And it can be anything you want, but it's not usually going to be a complete solution plugged in one time.
So just to come back to the SEO thing real quick, there is a Yoast module for Drupal called Real-Time SEO for Drupal. Its project name is Yoast_SEO. We will put a link in the show notes. Anybody's interested, you can apparently get some pretty cool SEO functionality out of that. Mm-hmm. Catherine, you raise a great point in the fact that, Drupal is very much like Legos. You kind of put it together. It's highly customizable. You have APIs that come out of it, all sorts of good stuff, right? WordPress is, as we've discussed, kind of an easier solution to get off the ground and running with. Nick highlighted a great theme ecosystem that you can use, right? It's fun. It's better maybe for SEO. My question is, we've talked about a couple of different scenarios in which you would use WordPress, right? Are there any like other scenarios that come to mind where you'd use WordPress over Drupal? I mean, for me, I guess the first one that I think of is like somebody that just needs like a portfolio website to get it up quickly. Like you can just kind of drop that right into WordPress and like get moving, right? But are there any other instances where you're like, oh, you know what? WordPress does this type of site really well, and you should always consider it?
I would always say that MVP projects, because if if you have a great idea and you just want to try it out, WordPress will be one of the best solutions, because you just take all those pre-made blogs. Yeah, it won't be the fastest site, it won't have the best experience, but you will be able to very quickly test your idea without very often even hiring someone else, sometimes even without any additional coding knowledge. And you can really create a quite complicated website. I mean, you can create a quite complicated e-commerce and LMS.
So
there are like
so
a lot
what
of
I'm
solutions.
what I'm hearing is WordPress is a good MVP, kind of like proof of concept website builder tool before you move your site to Drupal, so that you have full functionality, customizable functionality and whatnot.
I would say it would depend, because this is also one of the problems with WordPress, that because of this low entry barrier, it got this bad reputation, because many people just don't know what they are doing, and in the result it's all WordPress fault.
Mm-hmm.
Very often it's not. The problem is because, for example, I had the pleasure to work for WPM UDev as a second line support. So in short, it was those most interesting cases why something doesn't work. And really, we saw people who had like hundreds of plugins installed, and for example 3 caching plugins, and because they thought that if they will install 3 caching plugins, the website will go like 3 times faster than usual, right? Because it's logical. But there are also companies who really know what they're doing with WordPress, and they can create amazing things from it. Sometimes it will be like let's say monolith WordPress solution. Sometimes there will be headless. But if you do WordPress in a good way, it will work. It will work great. I mean, the White House is working on WordPress, and I know it was on Drupal.
It used to be Drupal,
Yeah.
right?
It used to be
I think that goes back to what you were saying before, right? Is that like, you can build it in so many different ways. So like if you build it well, right, you're gonna have maybe a better experience. I think a lot of people, like they come into a WordPress site and like somebody's done something where like inappropriately or built it, configured it oddly, right, and they go, oh, this is WordPress is just terrible, like, right. That's true of I think both platforms. So
before we go on, could we mention really quickly that WordPress still works on cheap hosting? I think that's a huge benefit. That's
true.
Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah, but I would say it's
so
also
but that's fair.
Honestly, I would say that it's also one of the biggest problems, because I like to say that WordPress is like it's not backward compatibility. It's like a paranoical backward compatibility. It's like we really should not do this. We should really push more forward.
WordPress is due for a full rebuild. Drupal did that when Drupal did, as you brought up a couple of times. When Drupal went on to Symfony, it was essentially a full rewrite. We went from fully procedural to object oriented. We lost a lot of our developers due to that. A lot of them have made their way back, and it is much better in the promised land now. But the first 6 months or a year after that transition, it was tough. It was very tough, even as an experienced developer. WordPress is probably due for a similar thing at some point. They kind of have to have a new slate. But
in one way, we did it. But instead of changing what's underneath, we decided for a new paint job. So Gutenberg.
Yeah.
We decided to still use the legacy core, but add the new layer with cool React blogs and content creation.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say that was. I mean, partially it wasn't a bad idea because WordPress editor needed some huge changes, but still we are running on really old parts, and this is becoming more and more of a problem.
I also wanted to quickly answer that question too. Since I am a Drupal developer that has built a site recently in WordPress, just to kind of give some insight into why I chose WordPress over Drupal. And the reason is I wasn't hired to build the WordPress site so much as to build a environment agnostic design system. And so we, the client, and I've mentioned this project a couple times on the show, but for new listeners and for Maciej, like the client has thousands of websites on WordPress, on Silverstripe, on Drupal, on Google sites, straight HTML sites. And my client was building a design system for them. And they wanted to have a system where they could deploy the design system to all those different environments. And so we selected native web components because native web components are just HTML and JavaScript, right? It's not tied to Twig. It's not tied to some templating engine that one site might have and another site might not. It's literally just HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So it will work everywhere. And part of their delivery was giving them a working option in WordPress. And so I was hired to help build that whole design system. And then the WordPress site was kind of just a side effect proof of concept to make sure that it does work in multiple systems, not really so much that I was hired to build a WordPress site. And so for the future, I think that's the only time I would do it again. Like after having built a complex site in WordPress, I guess kind of what Catherine and John said, if I had a simple like blog site that was never going to grow, I would probably, I might consider WordPress for that. But honestly, a complex site, and I would not choose WordPress for a complex site.
So, then I guess the next question is for everybody. When would you use Drupal over WordPress? I can think of some obvious ones, but I wonder what y'all think.
Well, I'm curious your opinion, Maciej. Since you're primarily a WordPress developer and you've only dabbled in Drupal, what's a project that might come across your desk that would make you say, maybe I should reevaluate Drupal?
And this is kind of interesting because when I worked at my previous company, we had one webinar with the Drupal company called CyberDuck. And we talked about this, where to use Drupal over this, and I remember that that this was again this about going more enterprise, and so probably. But the problem is that with enterprise sites, you have to be really sure of your knowledge. So probably. For me, it would be so. I would start if I would have to give it a try with something simpler to have a comparison with WordPress versus Drupal. So probably, I would start with a blog, right? To learn. But for sure, when I know that one of the more badly solve things at WordPress is the database structure. I mean, you can override it in some way, but you constantly feel that it's not fully natural. And so if I would have to work with something with a more complex database, I would probably give Drupal a try in this case.
I think that's a great point too, because one of the things I've noticed, you've mentioned performance a couple of times, but in my book, the big triggers are if it needs to be high performance, if it's highly structured data, if it's interacting with several APIs. I mean, that's Drupal all the way. But even on the more simple performance side, I know that I have a client that does WordPress and Drupal, and they asked me to look at a performance issue in WordPress that they were having. They had they had a page that was returning results from the database, and in Drupal this would just be a view, and it was querying, I think, 4 things. So we had to build, I forget what it's called, me something query, MQ query,
A meta
meta
query.
query. Yeah, it was a meta query. The meta query had 4 different options, and it was just falling down. Like it could not handle just 4 different taxonomy terms and 2,000 results. It was taking 40, 50 seconds to respond. Whereas in Drupal, you build a view that has 5 or 6 exposed filters, and thousands of pieces of content. It's not going to be quick. It might take 5, 6 seconds, 8 seconds, but it will return. Whereas in WordPress, it just it could not handle it. They ended up having to build their own custom index to get it to work.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah, or just creating a custom data, a custom table for this, because the way, I mean, the WordPress database structure is kind of interesting because it's so universal. You can do everything with this without even touching the database until the moment you realize when your site grows. Or, for example, you decide to add e-commerce because WooCommerce still uses.
I was going to
mostly
ask
this
about that.
structure.
Like I was
Okay,
I-
so
the one thing that I've always heard that it is like painful and hard to do with WordPress is e-commerce. Is that still the case, or is it something where, like, so Drupal has Drupal Commerce, which is like built right in, right? I'm wondering, like, is that a scenario where if you're like, or I mean, obviously you could go to like something like Shopify or some platform as a service solution, right? But like, if you're looking at doing e-commerce, is WordPress like automatically out, or are you thinking like, well, there might be some way to do it?
I would definitely would think about WooCommerce. Again, mostly because of the number of plugins, of payment gateways, of everything. I mean, like, I'm from Poland, and we have a lot of solutions that are only available in Poland. For example, I don't know, a delivery company that only exists in Poland, and a payment gate that is only available in Poland. And this is always a great filter when I hear that there is this new company that created a great and perfect shopping experience. And the first thing I go and I just check, but it's great, but it won't work in Poland at all because there are no services that are available here. So, and I go to WordPress and I see that there are add-ons for WooCommerce that will solve those problems. And believe me, even the invoicing system in Poland is quite complicated because there are many rules that have to be that we have to keep in mind when sending the invoice to a client. But even apart from this, WooCommerce is a very good solution. Of course, you have to know what you are doing, and probably at some point, if you are going with a very high traffic approach, you probably will have to rebuild your database a bit. So it stops being this no-code solution. So
I have to say that's actually one thing that I noticed with teams that I work with WordPress is in Drupal. I mean, this is a little bit of hyperbole, so take it with this like grain of salt. But in Drupal, the database is kind of sacred, right? I'm very, like, there are times when you have to go in and modify something in the database, or you have to restore a backup, right? But the bar for doing that is very, very, very high. But I feel like in WordPress, like, it's like, oh, if you're like, for example, the process for pulling a production database down to your local and then making it ready for that is you have to like go in the database and change the WP metadata URL to point at whatever your local URL is, or it's not going to work. And
you can overwrite it in WP config, so you can.
Oh, I guess you could do it. Okay, I didn't know that you could do that. But like when you look up instructions how to do it, like what you find is like that you go in the database and update that. It's like, how is that the recommended way? It's kind of mind blowing. But
yeah, that's true. I mean, but it's kind of funny, but because the reason behind it is kind of the same. The database structure is sacred. The problem is that it's not so perfect, and sooner or later you have to change it, because, like I said, WordPress database structure is so universal that you, and I think that this is the biggest difference between good and bad developers when it comes to the WordPress world. The ones who know how to handle databases and the ones that don't know a thing about it.
Yeah.
Because WordPress really doesn't encourage you to do anything about the database. You just should, I mean, in theory, you should use some functions, some methods that WordPress has, and that's it. You should not ever think about what is happening underneath. And the problem is that if you want to go this extra mile, have this really high performant e-commerce site, for example, you have to do something with your database because you just have to.
Yep. So let's move on to another topic that we kind of sort of hinted at this earlier, but one of the big things in Drupal, the Drupal world in the last maybe 3-4 years has been making Drupal headless, right? Using Drupal kind of purely as a way to enter content, manage it, and then using something like Gatsby or React or Vue.js on the front end. Are headless setups an option in WordPress as well? Can you set up WordPress just to like store the data and then use Gatsby or React or something on the front end?
Yes, of course. I mean, if we'll go back at the moment when like everyone was creating Gatsby sites, there was this moment. I remember how much Gatsby invested in WordPress world. They even hired Jason Ball to work on his plugin for GraphQL for WordPress. So headless is a great option for WordPress. It's also a great option for the developers because you can use WordPress. I mean, this is a perfect mix for some people because developers will have access to new and shiny toys, right? They can play around with Next.js, with Astro, with Gatsby. But I think that Gatsby is right now in decline, so more Astro. And on the other hand, the end users will still have access to WordPress, and it will work like usual, and they don't have to worry about a thing. And the developers will be happy with playing around with the new shiny stuff. But on the other hand, I think that headless is kind of a threat for every CMS, because when we talk about like a typical headless approach, we think that we just take the CMS, like remove the theme and change it with some JavaScript framework. And that is kind of true, but in this scenario, it's there isn't as much to be gained thanks to this. But on the other hand, when we go with this more composable approach, so this is more for the enterprise. So imagine that you have a website, you use your favorite CMS for your blog, you use Shopify for the e-commerce approach, but then in your cart, you know that for managing promotion, there is another third-party tool. So in short, you combine many and many tools together. When you are small, it's a horrible approach, but when you are big enough and gaining each 1% of revenue gives you like a lot of extra cash, then it's worth it, right? And that's when composable comes in. The problem with composable is that all those solutions become very easily changeable because that's the nature of it. The moment when there is some traction, when you feel that something is slowing you down, change it. So today, WordPress is your favorite CMS. Tomorrow, let's change it for something else. And I had this great discussion with Cassidy Williams. Cassidy Williams worked as head of Devrel at Netlify. And she has huge experience when it comes to Jamstack, and she compared monolith versus headless as knitting versus building Legos. If you want to change something while you knit, you either have to patch it on what you already created, or you have a lot of work to like delete what you already created and recreate it again. With headless approach, it's like Legos. You find the element you want to change. Okay, there is some removing involved, but in general, it's simple. And while this is cool because we can play around with new technology, it's also a danger for each CMS that it can be changed at any moment. And it can be a very quick way from, yes, we can connect our favorite CMS with some new fancy JavaScript frameworks to, oh, no one is using our framework, our CMS anymore because...
I just want to say quickly, we did have a show with Sam Bagwat from Gatsby to talk about a modular approach, which I think fits in pretty well with what you were just saying. So if you want to go back and listen to that.
So I have a question around the whole headless thing, right? So Drupal has this idea of kind of like API focused out of the box, right? You can install Drupal, turn on the JSON API module, and you have like a fully functional API to be able to get your data out of Drupal if you need to, right? I'm wondering, does WordPress have something similar, or is it more of if you are going to use WordPress in a headless manner, you have to rely on a plugin for said headless approach? Does WordPress have APIs out of the box that you can tie into and get your data from?
WordPress has a REST API out of the box. Okay. And it's even used for not only for headless, but also for all the dynamic communication. Also, Gutenberg uses it in very, very often. And on the other hand, we can use GraphQL as a plugin because it's a bit more difficult to create the one and only GraphQL experience. That's why GraphQL probably will never be in the core. But yeah, you can choose both options, and it's up to you. Which one do you prefer?
So we talked about migration earlier with the module of the week, which was obviously a migration module. I wondered if you have any experience working on projects migrating from WordPress to Drupal or vice versa.
I won't lie, sadly not. I remember that I had a chance to work on a website that was migrated from Drupal to WordPress, but it was, the Drupal version was long time ago, and it was migrated into WordPress.
All right. I mean, that's a pretty fair answer there. Let's move on to our next question, which we kind of talked about already a little bit with the addition of Symfony to WordPress, right? So in the Drupal community, we have the idea of like getting off the island, right? Which means like using other services and other libraries to kind of like make our lives easier, right? So Drupal's using Symfony, Drupal's using CK Editor. So like we're kind of branching out into those communities, right? I'm wondering if you see WordPress getting off the island in the future, or if it's already getting off the island in some ways where, part of like WordPress core is using another library or a third party technology.
I would say that I think that our market share would have to start collapsing because this is kind of a problem of having this big market share that I can even tell you that WordPress has even its own coding standards. Mm-hmm. We aren't using PSRs. We are using WordPress coding standard. It's called like this. And the problem is because once a while there is a discussion. Maybe we should move to some more universal standard and be like the rest of the PHP world. And very often we can hear the argument, but we are enormous. We have 40%. They should listen to us. Really, sometimes we go to this argument. So it's really cool that WordPress has this 40% of the market, but it's also a big problem of it. But because part of it is the fact that you can run WordPress on a quite old PHP version. So if we would cut this off, we would lose the market. And we don't want to lose the market because it would look bad. So I really think that for the good of WordPress, really something, I mean, yeah, it maybe not collapse, but it should start going down. So maybe then there would be more motivation towards, let's change something because we have a serious problem.
It sounds like it almost sounds like getting off the island would cause a reduction in adoption of or use of WordPress, right? Because like you think of, I think Nick talked about it earlier with the shift from like object oriented to coding thing. Nick, help me out.
Say that again.
Oh, procedural.
Yeah, procedural. Thanks.
Yeah.
I'm like, what
sorry,
is the word?
We all had a simultaneous
blanking completely.
I was just mesmerized by the hand motion.
Right, me too.
Hand motions.
What is
like,
happening?
I knew the word procedural, but I'm like, wait a minute.
Please feel free to make a GIF about this. So we talked about the changes between object oriented to procedural in Drupal and how like a lot of people
the other way around. We went from procedural to object.
Yes, you're right. I know this. It's funny how much you forget things. Anyway, so we move into object oriented. Some people love it. Some people don't like it. And we saw kind of a split in the Drupal community, right? So like you're saying like moving to, more off the island sort of things for WordPress could cause a similar split. And that's kind of like guiding their decision making in the fact that like, okay, well, we have such a large market share, which is great on paper. Like, oh, WordPress has such a large market share, right? But you're running it on older versions of PHP, right? You're not, you're not standardizing on things like, for example, I imagine like being part of the Symfony community is great for both WordPress and Drupal, right? Because we're all using the same core thing, right? And by nature, we can make that thing better, and it benefits both of us, right? So like, I think it's an interesting point of view to say like, hey, we're kind of held back by the fact that we have such a large market share and we don't want to, basically piss people off and have them leave the project. Right. So like that kind of like begs the question to me, like that feels like at some point, like the runway is going to run out for that, where you're going to be like, on very old versions of PHP, and there are going to be issues, and people are going to then go, WordPress, it's kind of like big and goofy and potentially has security risks, right? Because that's one of the things like I feel like I hear all the time is like, oh, somebody didn't upgrade their
plugin
WordPress site for like 6 years, and now somebody hacked it and like bad things, right? So like it feels like one of those problems, and I think this is what you were getting at, where like eventually they're going to be forced to kind of make those changes.
Yeah, that's true. And on the other hand, I mean, right now we are having this discussion with PHP 8.2, and it's kind of funny because WordPress was pushing very much when it comes to PHP 7. I think 7.3 or 4 gave the WordPress the biggest speed increase from all the version. I don't remember 7.4 or 7.3, some of those. And I remember that this was the moment when really the whole community was pushing towards, upgrade your WordPress, start using PHP 7. Let's say 4. I really don't remember which number it was. And right now, when we are talking about PHP 8.2, I mean, using those newer PHP versions gives you more of a better developer experience. access to new version of tools and so on and so on.
Yeah.
But it doesn't give you this increase of speed. And suddenly we hear that, yeah, that's cool that WordPress 8.2 is coming, but we don't have any interest in it. I mean, it won't change as much as the 7.4. And honestly, it's a horrible argument, because it means that the developers who are trying to be as bleeding edge as possible, they're trying to keep up with what is happening in PHP, are considered as this group that we don't care about so much, because
Yeah. It's interesting to me because one of the things that people forget is, and I saw this discussion in the Drupal community, right? When a Drupal version starts supporting a specific version, that doesn't mean that you update. If you maintain a contributed module, that doesn't mean you update your code to use that version. You have to write your code to the oldest supported version, because if it's supported, that means that it needs to work there. And so let's bring this to kind of the Drupal versus WordPress again. So Drupal 10 just came out. Drupal 10 supports from, I think, 8.0 to 8.2, right? So Drupal 10 officially won't work on 7.4 or older, which is a good thing, because 7.4 is no longer supported, right, by PHP itself.
Exactly.
If you look at WordPress, the newest version of WordPress only works 8+ in beta, so it officially isn't supported, and it supports all the way back to 5.6. PHP
I think
5.6.
I think that officially we moved to 7. That the minimal version is.
Oh, they must not have
formally
updated
7.
the compatibility chart, because and I'll put this in the show notes. The compatibility chart says that
Yeah, because
WordPress 6.1 supports 5.6, which is like, isn't that like 20 years old at this point?
yeah,
Like,
I mean, because it's, again, this is a bit of chaos here, because for example, each plugin can say that, okay, we will work only on PHP
Yeah.
and some PHP version and newer. There was also some movement that sadly failed to connect the releases of new WordPresses and the minimal PHP version together with what is happening with the official WordPress version. And there was a great plan for it. And it was really nice, because it was quite conservative, but it would still push forward. So it would be great. Juliet did an amazing thing. She wrote the whole project. But yeah.
Wait, before we well, thank you for joining us. Before we close out, I think we're just gonna do a party line vote here on which CMS we prefer. But we're gonna go around the room and say which you prefer. So John, maybe we can start with you. Have we converted you to the WordPress camp?
Yeah, I mean, short answer, no. I think like this whole conversation, even to the last point, has highlighted the fact that, like, Drupal is a flexible, like, developer focused CMS, and WordPress is like a easy out of the box, like, designer focused CMS. And I think because of the flexibility, I'm Drupal all the way.
How about you, Catherine?
Oh, I mean, I think predictably, I'm still in the Drupal camp, again, for the robustness and flexibility, but I still have a lot of love for WordPress. I think WordPress is useful for certain things, but if I have to pick one, I'm going with Drupal.
I'm going to vote present. No, I mean, honestly, especially for my client base, I mean, Drupal is a fit. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I chose to specialize on it. I mean, early in my career, I realized there are a lot of great CMSs out there, but for my career, it made more sense to specialize in one of them. So I chose Drupal. So it makes sense that my client, like, I would choose Drupal on projects, because, it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. My clients are clients that are better suited for Drupal. So, and they generally hear about me because of Drupal. So it makes sense that we're going that way. And I think that, WordPress, like John said, it has some strengths, especially around kind of easy out of the box. And, Drupal used to be that as well. And there's an initiative for kind of fixing that, the easy out of the box initiative. But yeah, I think it's clear that I'm still in the Drupal camp. Well, how about you, Maciej? Have we convinced you to try Drupal, or are you still firmly?
To try, yes, especially the headless version, because with me it's kind of similar as with you, but I just specialized in WordPress for many years, so I know all those quirks and everything. So I would say that I'm much more experienced. But on the other hand, I can say that lately I'm trying out more and more outside of WordPress box of WordPress bubble. So, for example, like I mentioned StateMic a few times already. It's a really interesting CMS built on top of Laravel. And I'm also experimenting a bit with many headless CMSs. For example, Sanity.io, it's also a very interesting solution. So if you want to go all in when it comes to those bleeding edge and so cool JavaScript stuff, Sanity is really, really interesting.
Yeah, each CMS kind of has its place, and a lot of it is experience. And I want to say, for our listeners, if you guys have opinions or thoughts when you choose one way or the other, I'd love to hear them. Because each project is different, that's for sure.
Oh yeah, because CMS is just a tool. We have to remember about it.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for joining us. We appreciate your perspective on all this.
Oh, and it was really nice to meet you. And John, your hand movement was really top notch.
I do what I can. If you have questions or feedback, reach out to Talking Drupal on Twitter with the handle Talking Drupal, or by email at show@talkingdrupal.com. You can connect with our hosts and other listeners on Drupal Slack in the Talking Drupal channel.
And you can promote your Drupal community event on Talking Drupal. You can learn more by going to talkingdrupal.com/tdpromo.
Get the Talking Drupal newsletter for show news, upcoming Drupal camps, local meetups, and much more. Sign up for the newsletter at talkingdrupal.com/newsletter.
And thank you, patrons, for supporting Talking Drupal. Your support is greatly appreciated. You can learn more about becoming a patron at talkingdrupal.com and choose Become a Patron. Okay, Maciej, if our listeners want to get in touch with you, what's the best way for them to do that?
I think Twitter, it's Palmiak -FP.
Perfect. And Catherine, how about you?
I think all of my various contact stuff is on my aforementioned WordPress personal site, catherinedruckman.com. You can find my Mastodon link, Twitter, open.intel. You can find my writing there occasionally. Yeah, I think that's everything.
How about you, John?
You can find me on all the major social networks and Drupal.org at John Picozzi, and you can find out about EPAM at epam.com.
You can find me online pretty much everywhere at Nixvan, NICXVAN.
And if you've enjoyed listening, we've enjoyed talking.